What's
In
your
this
thing?
week's In-Ear Insights, I have something new, Katie. I have something that I built because one of the things that we were talking about recently was making content more accessible to people,
Uh-huh.
particularly useful tips and things. Because as much as I like to geek out on the intricacies of like the latent space in a language model, most people don't care. Most people are like just tell me what to do within reason. Is that a fair statement?
That is, I would say that is completely a fair statement. And that's sort of, that's the challenge that I know that, you run into and I run into is that, we want to make sure people understand the why and they want to know the why until we actually tell them. And then they're like, great, I don't care. So they think they want to know, but they really just want to get to doing the thing. And it is a challenge because you and I are so like, it is so much in our DNA to really understand how the thing works before we do the thing, that we feel like we also then have to get everybody else on the same page as us before they can do the thing. And they're just like, "Great, what button do I push?"
Exactly. So one of the most popular things that we've produced along those lines is our race strategy for prompting for
Mhm,
generative AI, right? So role, action, context, execution. And if you follow this framework for using generative AI, it's a good starting point. It's not
mhm.
by any means the be all end all of prompting, but it's a good place to start, especially if you are new to language models. Well, one of the things that we've done a lot of in our keynotes and our workshops and our webinars and stuff is talk about ways to improve the performance of a model once you start using it, once you start prompting it. And so last night I was bored, as one does, I created the four generative AI power questions for language models. So I figured today we would talk through these a little bit and help folks understand what they are, when to use them. They're all pretty straightforward. So the four questions are: what do you know about this topic? What questions do you have? What did I forget to ask? And did you fulfill the conditions of the prompt? And the way you would use these questions during a session with ChatGPT or Google Gemini or Anthropic's Claude, it depends on what you're trying to do. But these four questions will help you get much better results out of the model. So before I go on, what questions do you have, Katie?
First of all, you know how much I love surprises. So I'm processing as quickly as my poor brain can possibly process this early in the morning. Second question. That was the first one was not a question actually. So here we are. First question. Oh my goodness. Let me take a step back for a second for those listening. So Chris was covering, we developed or we came up with the RACE framework for people who are trying to figure out how to get started with generative AI. And so, as Chris mentioned, that is role, action, context, execution. And so, basically, the role is who you need generative AI to be, who you're talking to. So if you're going to be asking a question about B2B marketing, the role then that generative AI needs to play is a B2B marketer. So today you need to be a B2B marketer who's an expert in this. The action, what do you need it to do? I need you to help me with my email marketing strategy. Context, here's my limitations, here's what I know, here's what I have, here's my audience, so on and so forth, and then execute. With all of this information, I need you, and it's a reiteration of the action. I need you to help me build a strategy. So that's the race framework. So I just wanted to sort of do a quick review for anyone who's not familiar with it. So now to this new for generative AI power questions. We can get into it after we get into the framework, but why it's called power questions is one of my question versus just questions.
Because
So
it
it's
sounds cool.
subjective. All right, so we have expand, augment, complete, validate. As you were talking, my poor marketer brain was like, but that doesn't spell anything
It
because
doesn't
as
spell anything.
as marketers we're so ingrained for the acronyms. So, I'll be overthinking that later. Okay, so now that I've bought myself some time to process the information that I've been presented by reviewing the information that I've currently had. All right, so it's interesting because basically, like in a very simplistic way, if you're working with a generative AI model, you're asking it to like check itself. You're saying, are you lying to me or do you actually know what you're talking about without asking that specific question, because that's the wrong question to ask. But you're saying, do you even know about this thing? Am I even talking to the right person? Find me somebody who does know about this thing. If it's not you, then let's not have this conversation because it's a waste of my time. And then it's like, what questions do you have? Which is that's helpful, because we as humans, even if we use something like the race framework, we may not be giving enough information. So we may have some holes. So you're giving the model a chance to say, well, either your information was contradictory or you didn't give me enough of it. And then what is it? Complete. What did I
What did I
overlook?
forget to ask?
What did I forget to ask? Again, it goes with, what questions do you have? And then what did I forget to ask? I would be interested to know how these models come up with the responses and then validate. Do you have full confidence of the prompt, or, full awareness? Like, do you have enough information to do this thing? Which is also a really good question. And I can see where you've borrowed from straight management, because these are questions that you would want to ask somebody that you're working with, somebody that you would delegate to. You know, so Chris, if you say to me, "Hey, Katie, I need you to write a SQL query," your first question should be, "Do you know how to write a SQL query?" So that's the expand. And then, what questions do you have? And I would say, "Great, what SQL?" That wouldn't actually be my question, but like as an example, and so on. So I think it's a really good framework for people who are trying to get more out of it. For those folks that are saying, "Well, I tried to use generative AI and it's not working for me," so they've just dismissed it.
Right. So there's some technical things going on behind the scenes here that are not exposed by these power questions, but are really important. So the first one, what do you know about this topic, does two things. One, to your point, it validates, like, does this model know this topic well? Is it lying to me? So if you were to put in something simple like, what do you know about B2B marketing strategy? It's going to come up with a decent starting point. If you were to put in, what do you know about junction 13,644 on Open Reading Frame 1A and the SARS-CoV-2 virus? The model's probably going to go, and make a bunch of things up, because that's not something that there's been a lot of training data about. And so when you start with, what do you know about this topic, or what do you know about the best practices for it, you're validating, yes, you know what you're talking about, or no, you don't know what you're talking about, and I need to provide extra context. I need to provide the data for that.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing it does, and this is part of the C in the race framework, context. The way a language model works is kind of like a choose your own adventure book. If you remember those books when we were kids, like, it's a pirate story. It says at the end of this page, choose this one or this one. As you're reading that book, you are making the choices, and you keep going, choosing your own adventure, and but you don't cover the entire book in one setting. You cover only the choices that you made to tell that story.
Mm-hmm.
That's how a language model works, except it does it by word. And the key part is that as it's generating, everything that it makes and everything you prompted is part of the story, if you will, and it helps the model make the next choice. So when you ask a model, what do you know about this topic? And it spits out 8 paragraphs of, hey, here's what I know about B2B marketing and all the stuff. That becomes part of the next prompt. So you are, by asking it what it knows, you're essentially preloading a lot of knowledge into the session that you're working with to get the model up to speed faster. That's less information you have to provide in the prompt.
Would you advise people who are using this tactic to actually know the topic themselves? Because, what is the likelihood that a generative AI model is still hallucinating the information? Like, how do we know that? So if you say, what do you know about beekeeping? Now, if I know nothing about beekeeping and I ask the model, how do I know that the information it's giving me is correct?
If you know nothing about it, you don't know. In the same way that if you asked an intern, a human intern, and they made something up, you would not know either. The rule of thumb is this: the more specific the information, the more likely hallucination is, because beekeeping is a very broad, a general topic, right? So is B2B marketing, so is something like that. Something like, what does the genomic sequence on, section 13,644 of Open Reading Frame 1A on the SARS-CoV-2 virus is such a specific piece of knowledge that is so niche and so there's going to be so little training data about it that the probability of hallucination is very high. because the model probably hasn't trained on that information. Same is true for very new information. If you just read a new paper that came out last week on a given topic, and you were to query a model about that topic without providing the paper, the model is going to fall back on what it statistically knows, and it's probably going to hallucinate. So broad, you're probably safe. Narrow, specific niche, danger of hallucination increases. Brand new knowledge, the danger of hallucination increases. And as you go further down that rabbit hole, the need for subject matter expertise increases.
Okay, so if you don't know a lot about the topic and you're asking the model, then you have no way of validating that whether or not it's giving you correct information. So rule number 1, if you're asking the model what it knows, you also need to know the information. You can't ask for something that you don't know about and be able to feel confident that it also knows.
Correct. And this goes back to, no surprise, the 5 Ps, right? So if you're writing this just as, a social media post on LinkedIn, the purpose is pretty clear and the risk is pretty low. But yeah, you might get made fun of if you say something silly. But if you are publishing a legal document on your website that you will be held legally accountable for, the risk is very high. And therefore, you absolutely should not be doing that without someone who has subject matter expertise reviewing, right? Keeping the human in the loop, human review of that content. I mean, in general, you should be having humans review AI output. But if you don't have that subject matter expertise and it's something that is potentially risky, don't do it. Don't do it, because there's a very good chance that something will be off.
No, and it's a good best practice in general, whether or not you're using generative AI or, humans, someone who has subject matter expertise should be present.
Exactly. The second question, what questions do you have, is essentially, it does 2 things. One, these models are very knowledgeable, particularly the newest vintages, Claude 3, Gemini 1.5, etc. They're very, very knowledgeable. One of the flaws that we have as humans is we don't think to ask what questions they might have. When I'm writing code, this is the most important question to ask, because as I'm explaining to the model what I want to do, I ask it what questions you have, and very often it asks things like, "Hey, do you want some error checking? Because you didn't tell me about it." Like, "Oh yeah, I guess so." "Do you want this? Do you want that? Is this important to you?" And we forget about those things. And that goes with question 3, which is, what did I forget to ask? Again, these models have a lot of completeness of information in them. So as you are prompting them, when you get that first set of results back, and you clarify when you have a conversation with the model, say, what did I forget to ask about this? What am I overlooking? What are my blind spots? This is a question that helps you with professional development, because as you prompt, you want to use these tools to help give you more things to research, more things to learn about.
It's really good. It's a really good framework both for the machines, but also just for interacting with people. And only to pick on you a little bit because, we know that you prefer machines over people. What strikes me as interesting is, so I've worked with you for almost 10 years now, and I've never heard you ask these questions to a person. And so I would encourage anyone who's listening, who's like, I don't know where I'm struggling with delegation, because that's the number one question that I always get is, how do I delegate better? This is a really good framework for delegation for someone that you're like, well, and this was always, a challenge, Chris, that we had at the agency was, well, I can't delegate this to anyone because they won't do it the same way that I do. But these questions would be helpful in that conversation. So as the person to person in the conversation, I've asked these questions and I know how they work with people. And so it's fascinating to me then to see it translated from person to machine, where you can ask the same questions and get similar results as if you're talking to a person. It's now, have you ever run into an instance? So I think about like job interviews, for example, because you can always sort of tell, how the interview is going when you say to the person you're interviewing, do you have any questions for me? And they're like, no, I'm good. You're like, okay, that means you're not very well prepared. Have you ever run into that instance with a large language model where you said, what questions did I forget to ask? What questions do you have for me? And the model's like, no, I'm good. I have another meeting to get to.
And not, it won't say it like that, but I have run into cases where it says the information you provided is complete and comprehensive. I don't have any questions, so let's begin the task.
And do you believe it?
I do, because I've gotten in the habit. The machines have trained me, believe it or not, to build better requirements, because I will keep asking it what questions you have, and I keep copying and pasting responses back and forth until the requirements for a piece of code are so comprehensive that when I say, okay, let's generate the code, what questions you have, it says, we've answered them all, you're all set.
Interesting.
As an example,
go ahead.
I have here that I was working on a piece of code for WordPress last night, and the machine kept walking me through, what about this, what about this, what about this, do you want error logging, do you want to show progress of the task, do you want to do this? And so it basically was training me to write better requirements, because this then becomes the prompt for part of the prompt for generating the code.
At any point as a human, does it get tiresome? Like, I guess, how much patience do you feel like you have to have? Or is it because there's no emotion involved with the machine, like it's not a problem?
It's not a problem. It's a machine. I know it's dumb. I know it has no existing context. We call these things in the keynotes we deliver, we call them the world's smartest, most forgetful interns, right? Every time you start talking to it again, it's like, it remembers nothing, but it's very smart. So I feel like when I'm working in a session with one of these things, I know it has no memory. It couldn't tell me what it had for lunch. And our expectations of it, my expectations of it are much lower than my expectations for a human being, right? Which is why I'm more patient with it, because I know it has no memory whatsoever. And so I understand every time I address the machine that I have to provide all this information. It's not going to know it.
That's interesting. All right. And so the last question here is validate.
Yes.
And so
did you fulfill the conditions of the prompt?
And so then that again goes back to you, the human, making sure you're writing a clear enough prompt so that the machine can go, yeah, I did exactly what you asked me. Because one of the things that I've learned from you is that it's not going to infer what you could have meant. It is going to take things literally, because there is no like, well, maybe he meant this, but he really said this. Like, that's not how these large language models work. And so you have to be very clear and specific with the prompt that you're giving it, so that when you get to that point of, did you fulfill the conditions of the prompt completely? Like, it's going to say yes. And you're going to say, well, that's not what I needed. That's on you, the human, because you did not specify exactly what it was that you needed.
This question I use the most when I see that it has done something incorrect. So let's say we're doing a thing with B2B marketing strategy, and it spits out a whole bunch of stuff, and I say, I want this in a bullet point outline format, and it gives me, prose from an article. I'll say, check your work. Did you fulfill the conditions of the prompt completely? And it will go back and go, oh, I'm sorry, you said a bullet point outline format. Here it is in a bullet point outline format. So anytime that I spot a mistake in the output, I will ask this question to get to clarify. And the reason you would want to do that is, instead of just starting over, is because you want to take advantage of all the knowledge, the story that you've read through so far in the Choose Your Own Adventure that is working with the AI. You would want to keep all that knowledge and just say, hey, just check your work and fix the mistakes you've made.
So do you feel like these questions for language models are really sort of the next phase of people getting better with using generative AI? Because again, sort of, like I mentioned earlier in this episode, I've seen a lot of people complaining, well, I asked generative AI to do something and it couldn't do it. So they just kind of gave up. But I feel like maybe they're not asking these questions. And so one of the things you talk about, Chris, is priming the model. And so I feel like expand this first, what do you know about this, is that exact example of priming the model. Because so I'm, this is me still processing, these questions that you showed me this morning. So the first thing you want to do is, what does the model know about this topic? And so that way, that sort of gives you the sense of, this is a good model to use, or I should find a different model that maybe has more information, or I have to provide the information to the model so that it knows what I'm looking for. What questions do you have? Again, I feel like that's just a really good question to be asking in general, whether it's to large language models or people. after you finish talking, like, what questions do you have? It's something that we do as speakers. We give a 45-minute presentation, and then we literally leave the next 10 minutes for questions. Like, what questions do you have? I just gave you a lot of information. And so
Mm-hmm.
it lends itself to, okay, people are processing all of this information. They probably need some more context, they need some time, they need to, like, ask about it. And then the third one was, I've now lost
Well,
what.
I actually like the way you're describing this. So I'm going through now and I am changing the section headings to spell
Mhm.
something like what you were talking about at the very beginning of the show about, like, well, this doesn't spell an acronym. It doesn't make any sense. What is this? But
Well,
Prime is exactly what you're doing.
it just makes it easier for people to remember it. So, like, it's the same way that I came up with my own goofy acronym for artificial intelligence, because now that I've spoken about it enough, I can remember regression, classification, and generation. But it's still easier for me to remember find, organize, classify, which spells out fog. So now we have pair, prime, augment, refresh, evaluate. Interesting. So we have race and pair.
Which is
Yeah.
awkward because the Brazilian version of the race framework is actually pace, because I was playing with some translation over the weekend. A couple of our friends in the Analytics for Marketers community speak Brazilian. One is their native language. And then someone on LinkedIn actually made a translation of the race framework in Spanish. And I didn't particularly like the translation as well, because it was so I had Gemini go through it and work with me to clean that up. So yes, you have race and pair, but it's pace in Brazilian.
I think that's okay.
Yeah, oh, it's totally
Um,
fine.
so do these frameworks work with any generative AI model, or does it really only work with, like, ChatGPT and Gemini?
These work with any large model. So large models would be ChatGPT, any version of it, Google Gemini, any version of it, Anthropic's Claude, any version of it, Microsoft Bing. They will work with Mixtral, for example. They will not work as well with very small models. So a
Mhm.
very small model would be like any of like the original Llama family models. But in general, you would, for what most marketers are using AI for, you wouldn't be using those models anyway. You'd be using one of the large public models.
Okay. What about, and I would imagine that this is gonna be a separate topic, but what about image generation? So there's content generation and there's image generation. I feel like we're in a different world with how we approach image generation. So to be clear, we're talking about content generation, text generation, word generation,
Right.
not using this with, like, a Photoshop, for example, or a
Exactly.
Dolly.
That's why we say it's power questions for language models.
Which I can see, for someone not as familiar, they would not necessarily know the difference. And, it's when I say things like that, I mean that I've made those mistakes before.
Yeah. No, and that's fair. The thing about I'm hesitant to do that with image models because image models are rapidly becoming language models. We already see this with like
Mhm.
ChatGPT, where it's ability to use its language to essentially write queries for Dolly, and then you don't need to do that weird janky image prompting language. Gemini's the same way. So as these tools become more and more multimodal, the skill for image generation is essentially going away, and it's being incorporated into the way a language model works, because it's more natural language anyway. You're like, I want to draw a picture of this, this kind of look like this, instead of arcane parameters like 16 by 9, 8K high def, etc. I was like, no one speaks like that. But people are used to telling a language model, hey, here's what I want. And so it makes total sense that that particular sub style of prompting will go away for most people, except the technical users. If there are technical users who want to finely control the output of an image model, they will be the ones to install Comfy UI. They will be the ones to have a specific model from Civet AI on their desktop that they use. They have like 40 different models for individual purposes. The average marketer, the average person, is not going to go through all that labor. So we now have our power questions, 4 power questions. If you would like a copy of this by the time this episode airs, you can go to trustinsights.ai/power questions and get a copy. No downloads, no form to fill out. Just, it's like our race framework. Just grab it and go. Of course, there is an ad for our services at the bottom, which I would be remiss if I did not do that. So
I would be a little upset with you.
any other thoughts, Katie, on this framework?
No, I think it's interesting. I think it's going to be helpful for those of us who have struggled to get what we feel is like the right output from generative AI. And we're just like, well, it must not be for me. I can't get it to work. Like Chris gets it to work into like 2 seconds, but I can't. So like, let me just leave it to him. So I feel like the more we can give people like myself these tools and tips to say, don't give up just yet. You're just not, there's more things that you can ask. There's more things that you can do before you give up. I think that that's going to be incredibly beneficial and helpful. And it will start to break down that barrier to adoption. Because I mean, I give generative AI a task and I still feel like, well, I could probably still do it better myself because
Mhm.
I'm not asking those questions.
Yep. And I remind folks too, again, this is something we teach in our course, which you can find at trustinsights.ai/AI course. Keep a prompt library, keep a prompt notebook of stuff. And then as you learn things like the race framework and the pair framework and stuff, update those prompts, keep them up to date. They are software. Right? A prompt is software. It's just not written in a programming language, but it is still software that you're writing code for, which means that you should be iterating. You should be improving it. It should have a life cycle which involves, maybe not formal Scrum and daily stand-ups and stuff, but at the same time, if it's a prompt that's important to your business, maybe it does, because maybe the software development life cycle should always apply to things that are important to your business.
Some kind of life cycle, some sort of regular check-in and maintenance definitely should apply. I rarely ever see a task as one and done, and then you just move on from it. To your point, especially if it's important to the business, it's something that you should revisit frequently.
It feels like you could write up something on the AI prompt development lifecycle, Katie.
Maybe that's a big ask for a Monday morning.
Well,
But
you
no,
have
it's definitely it's interesting because, you know, generative AI really is, at the end of the day, it's just another piece of software. It's just another tech to put into your stack. And you need to approach it as like you would any other piece of software. So that's definitely a topic for another day, but we can start exploring what that looks like.
exactly. If you've got some thoughts about the pair framework, the race framework, or just how you are getting results out of generative AI, pop onto our free Slack group. Go to trustinsights.ai/analytics for marketers, where you and over 3,000 other marketers are asking and answering each other's questions every single day. And wherever it is that you are watching or listening to the show, if there's a channel you'd rather have it on instead, go to trustinsights.ai/GI podcast. You can find us on the channel of your choice. And while you're there, please leave us a rating and a review. It does help to share the show. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk to you on the next one.